Bienvenue, I'm the Pickard. In my last video, I introduced you to Jolene, my 1963 2cv AZA with 425cc and 18 horsepower. But I kept that video pretty light on detail about 2CVs because it was an introduction and I wanted to keep things, like I said, light and easily digestible. But today I'm going to go in detail and tell you about all the weird and wonderful things that make up a 2CV. You see, the 2CV's original genesis comes from before the Second World War with a little car called the TPV, which was like an experimental model for Citroen. But after the war, everything old was bad and everything new was good. So Citroen set about literally reinventing the wheel. I'll get to that in a minute. But they kind of threw away everything that had gone before. The TPV, even though it looks a bit like a Citroen, even though it looks a bit like a 2CV, should I say, isn't really a 2CV. It has torsion bar suspension and it didn't really work very well. Some had little flathead engines, like 5-bolt wheels, not 3. Like, very, very different idea, although they look similar. The car that developed after the war was something very different indeed. And I'm going to start with the ground up, I think. I think that's the best way to do it. So, the tyres. A 2CV's tyres were obviously made by Michelin, because the car was made by Michelin. And if you're a tyre maker, you're not going to put rubbish tyres on your nice car after you've spent all that time designing it. And one of the reasons for the suspension on the 2CV and the cool way that the suspension works, I'll show you that, is because it shows off how cool Michelin's tyres are. See, Michelin had this cool idea of let's get people to drive around France and use up tyres and use their cars. And that's why the Michelin restaurant stars system, you know, a posh restaurant having so many stars, that's where that comes from. And Michelin actually produced maps of France and Spain and European countries to get people to get out in their cars, use their cars, go on holiday and explore Europe, which was quite a revolutionary idea. And it was all in aid of selling tyres. And the 2CV was one of the first cars in the world to not just have radial tyres, but also tubeless tyres. Now, you'll also notice the weird 3-bolt wheels. This is for a reason. 2CVs have self-balancing wheels. Now, if you've ever gone to a tyre shop, tyre fitting shop, a tyre fitting garage, whatever, and seen tyres fitted to a car, if you're not massively familiar, when they put the tyres on, they put the tyres on a special machine called a wheel balancer. And they spin the wheel up, and then they add little weights. They used to crimp them onto the rim, now they stick them on the inside so that they're less visible. And what they do is balance the wheel so that at speed the wheel doesn't shake, because the tyre might not be perfect, the wheel might not be perfect. When you marry the two together, they might not sit perfectly. And the little weight adds balance to the whole thing, because you've got 4 wheels, and if you're lacking balance, the whole car's going to shake like crazy, and it'll actually shake itself apart. And because the 2CV was designed for rural communities, much like the one I live in today, it was designed for a world where there was no infrastructure to support the little car. So, you couldn't find a tyre balancer, and you couldn't find a tyre shop. You had to do it yourself. These cars replaced horses, and these cars replaced horse and carts. So many farmers were used to fitting tyres themselves, but just not balancing the wheels. So Citroen came up with a very cool solution. This is a 2CV wheel. This is one of the spare wheels for my parents' car, which is a Diane. And this wheel is actually off an AMI 8, which neither of those are 2CVs, but they're also 2CVs. They're 2CV variants. But for all intents and purposes, this is a 2CV wheel. And you'll see that it has a rounded surface on the rim. and the holes look a bit big. And the reason for that is because this is a 2cv wheel nut. And a 2cv wheel nut has a washer fixed to the bottom. It's also galvanized, which is cool, so it doesn't rust. But it has this washer on the bottom that's fixed to the wheel nut. And that's round as well. Don't know if you can see that. And the reason is that your wheel nut sits on your rim and can actually move slightly. And that allows the wheel to balance itself as it rotates, which is quite ingenious. The next thing on our list is the suspension. 2cv suspension is utterly bizarre and works in a way that no other vehicle suspension does. No other car ever produced has suspension that works like a 2cv. The closest thing that is kind of similar is a Buell motorbike. Basically, the wheel is fitted to one side of an arm and the arm goes up and down, and that gives you your suspension, which is a pretty simple idea. And there are quite a few cars that have that system. But on a 2cv, there's a rod fastened to the bottom of the arm. That rod gets pulled when the car hits a bump and the suspension compresses. That rod goes through a spring to the back of the spring and squishes the spring. So the spring, trying to fire its way out, trying to push its way out, pushes the tyres into the ground, giving mega grip. It also happens that because the two springs are together, Citroen put them in a can, so they're interconnected. So when the front wheel hits a bump, it prepares the suspension at the rear to take the bump that the front has just hit. This gives the 2cv its cool, floaty ride. Early 2cvs like this are much softer sprung than later ones. And Jolene, being an earlier car also, has no shock absorbers. There is no damping at all on Jolene, other than some friction shocks, which live just there on the ends of the arms. Jolene's quite cool, she's got Teflon friction shocks. Later cars had push and pull, so they're like two-way shock absorbers that work when you hit a bump and then work on the rebound as well. First they were fitted only on the rear, like my parents' Diane, and then they were fitted on the front and rear as time went on. They feel a lot more grown up and a lot more serious and a lot more planted, whereas Jolene just feels like fun all the time. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people still gravitate to the earlier cars, even though the later cars are a lot faster. In fact, the last cars, the last 602s had literally double the horsepower of Jolene. Although Jolene has double the horsepower of the first cars. So. Next on our way up the car is the brakes. Now, because Citroen went to so much trouble designing the tyres, and then designing the wheels, and then designing the mad suspension, the next thing on the list was the brakes. Drum brakes front, drum brakes rear on Jolene. The later cars, some of the last cars, have disc brakes on the front. But most 2CVs, or most variants as well, have drum brakes, front and rear. And they work quite well. But the front ones are inboard mounted, which means they're not behind the wheels, they're actually up against the gearbox, they're inboard. Now, this is something that Jaguars are famous for, and also something that many Grand Prix cars, many Formula 1 cars, have had over the years. And what it does is it moves the weight away from the suspension, allowing the suspension to do its thing, because the lighter your wheels are, the lighter your suspension is, the better it can do its job, basically. Also, the handbrake isn't on the rear, it's on the front. So if you ever found yourself in a situation where your brakes weren't working, you could actually slow down using your handbrake. Not advisable, but it's an option, and a lot safer than having your handbrake on the rear. It's something that Saab actually used as well. The next thing on our list is the chassis. The chassis isn't massively special, actually. It's a very, very simple design. It's just a platform that everything bolts to. But it was designed to flex slightly. But when people started taking 2CVs across Africa and driving them around the world and driving them across South America, which is a market where the 2CV was incredibly popular, in Chile especially, and also Argentina. In fact, Chile and Argentina have their own special versions of the 2CV. Citroen produced a booklet. It's kind of like a pamphlet on how to reinforce your chassis for expedition use, which is quite cool. And I wish I had a copy. I've got a digital copy, but I really want an original copy of this little pamphlet because I'm a geek, and I collect things like that. After that, we have the fuel tank. Until 1963, 2CVs weren't fitted with a fuel gauge. They kind of were, actually, but it's not a fuel gauge you could see while you were driving. It's basically a stick with little brass markers on it. It's a beautifully made little stick that fits inside your fuel filler nozzle, so you can dip your fuel and see how much fuel you've got. This obviously resulted in certain people running out of fuel. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll notice I carry a spare jerry can of fuel, a tiny one, in my boot. I've never run out of fuel, but I have had it sputter and pulled over and put more fuel in it, because my car, like I say, it's the first year with a fuel gauge, and the fuel gauge kind of works sometimes, and when you go over bumps, the needle on the fuel gauge does this. It dances. The old school fix for this was to carry a beer bottle full of fuel, a glass beer bottle full of fuel in your boot. Fortunately, jerry cans are now a thing. After that, we have the gearbox at this end. Other than being aluminium and very low in the car, there's not actually anything, and having the brakes bolted to it, of course, there's not much that's that revolutionary about a 2CV gearbox. It has 4 gears, but it is quite far forward. And the gear stick comes up, and then there's a linkage that takes the gear stick into the cabin where you are, which gives the 2CV its characteristic broom handle gear shift. And the pattern's a bit weird. It's a HJ on an early 2CV, which means that first is towards you and back, reverse is all the way forward from there, and then second is neutral and forward, third is all neutral and all the way back, and then to get into fourth, you stay in third, turn the gear stick to the right, and then push it all the way forward, and it kind of stays at this jaunty angle. A bit weird, but you do get used to it incredibly fast, and the reason for this is because Jolene has no synchro mesh for first gear, so you have to double declutch in first gear unless you're stationary. So once you're moving, you go into second gear, reverse is out the way, first gear's out the way, and you spend most of your life kind of second, third, and then when you're on a fast straight road that's pretty flat, you can put it into fourth. And an option which Jolene doesn't have was a special clutch called the traffic clutch, which meant that when you come to a stop at, say, a junction or a set of traffic lights, you don't have to push the clutch in. You can just stop if you're in first gear, or if you're crawling through traffic, you can just stop and the car will actually disengage the clutch itself. Bit weird, and it never really caught on, but quite a cool idea nonetheless. Bolted to that, of course, is the engine. The engine's all aluminium, and it has a flat plane design, which basically means if your pistons are here, your pistons go out at the same time, rather than one then the other, one then the other, one then the other. The pistons actually go outwards like this as the engine rotates. And that means that when the engine fires, both pistons fire at the same time, and both pistons get moved at the same time by the engine. So she gets all of her power all in one gulp, which creates kind of this heartbeat thrum when you're driving. The other thing that the 2CV has is a pressed together crank, which if you're a motorcycle rider you might be familiar with. On a pressed crank, the bearings are actually pressed onto it, and the crank comes as one full assembly. This means that a 2CV can drive at full revs all day and not blow up. But when you replace the crank, it comes as one piece. A 2CV has no head gasket either, which means you can't blow a head gasket. It also has no radiator, no fan belt. The dynamo on Jolene is actually on the end of the crank, and the oil pump is on the back. So there's no belts driving accessories, so there's no belts to brake. She has no thermostat on the oil cooler, so it can never stick, and also she has no oil filter. This is a Citroen thing that went on for quite a long time. Citroen H vans are the same, they have no oil filters. I think many traction Avants have no oil filters, and a lot of 2CVs until like 1980 I think have no oil filters. The reason for this is if you couldn't get an oil filter because you couldn't buy one, it's better to replace your oil quite often than have a blocked filter that then blows your engine up, I suppose. So you have to replace your oil quite regularly, but it doesn't really matter because the engine only holds 2.5 litres of oil. There's very little to go wrong on a 2CV engine. On earlier 2CVs, the windscreen wipers are driven by the speedo cable, and there's a little tiny wheel that you turn that grips the speedo cable that allows your windscreen wipers to move. Jolene, being a 1963, is the first car with electric windscreen wipers. Although some cars were fitted earlier on as like an aftermarket option, because there were loads of aftermarket little gizmos and doodads you could buy for your 2CV that made life just that little easier. Like a little tiny screen that fits here, that when you're driving with your window open, stops you getting a cold elbow. And my car has an ENAC kit, which is a dealer-fitted option, which gives you the hatchback, that's why my car is a hatchback, and a folding rear seat. There were also some very weird options, like a child seat built into your rear seat, which looks horrendously dangerous, and 500cc kits and many intake kits and exhaust kits to give you that little bit more performance, which I think came in very handy for the 9 horsepower cars and the 13 horsepower cars. People laugh about the 9 and 13 horsepower cars, but like the 9 horsepower cars, I think they have a top speed of, I think, like 30 miles an hour or something like that. But when you think about it, after the Second World War, with France's bombed to death roads that had been destroyed by both like ally and enemy tanks, you couldn't really do much more than 30 anyway, so you might as well save the fuel. The next thing on the list is the headlights, and in true Citroen simplicity, the dip of the headlights is a physical thing. The headlights are on a bar, they're connected, and when you're in the car you can turn a little wheel and you can raise and lower the headlights to dip them. And they're on little ball joints, so you can actually angle the headlights very easily and simply, and all from home. Again, all these things make a 2CV an absolute joy to work on and an absolute joy to own, although there are tons of 7 and 9mm bolts in an early 2CV especially. So if you do buy a 2CV, or if you do own a 2CV, you end up using a lot of the spanners in your toolbox that you've never used before. Next thing, the windows. On this sheet. Oh. The windows simply fold up, and you detach the window like that, and they go back down again. Very simple and very easy. The seats were designed to come out for picnics. Lunch in France is a huge deal, and everything stops for lunch. Lunch is sacred, and in summer you'll often see families on roundabouts or in laybys or just pulled into some random field to have lunch. Of the seats, they're a simple steel tubular design, but the cool thing is they are sprung by rubber bands. Michelin, of course, being a company that made rubber stuff, thought, what's easier than a spring? A rubber band. So the seats are actually held together with little hooks and rubber bands The seat covers in Jolene are actually from a Charleston, which is a later special edition 2cv. And they're like a fuzzy t-shirty kind of fabric. They're not massively padded, although they are incredibly comfortable and hammocky. The seats that this car actually came with look a lot like the sort of seat cushion that you'd put on on loan furniture, really. These came along afterwards, and then later on, thickly foam padded seats. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this window into the weird and wonderful engineering that makes up this weird and wonderful little car. It's incredibly eccentric and incredibly simple, which makes it an absolute joy to work on for a home mechanic. Like, every single thing is easily accessible and easily doable, pretty much. In fact, the other day Jolene burnt out a starter motor, bless her. After 55 years, I think, her starter motor packed up and I've had to order a new one. Fortunately, the starter motor comes off with just 3 bolts. It pretty much is that simple, 2 spanners and 3 bolts. She couldn't be easier to work on. Oh, and a cable. And that's it. So, if you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like or a comment or something down below. It helps this channel massively. Let me know what you think of these videos. My last video was massively popular and the most popular video I've had in quite a long time. So thank you all for watching. Thank you all for stopping by, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.